Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to see everybody here today. Thank you for joining us for this third in the series of essentially looking at the criminal justice system in Norway. Corrections as rehabilitation. Norway shares its stories of success. Today, we're going to be focusing on the youth justice system, and we're very pleased to be joined by two experts in that from Norway, Per Sigurd and Per Omdal, as well as four guests from Connecticut who have a background in the youth justice system here. And we're going to be focusing on human rights, and in particular the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child and what that means when setting up the foundation of a justice system. So as I mentioned, this is the third in the series. We had two others so far. The first one, we focused on learning a little bit about the background of the entire justice system in Norway. We were joined by two professors who had a lively conversation about that. And then the second one, we actually went inside a facility and spoke with some prison officers from the Inner Oslo prison in Norway. And we're able to, in essence, kick the tires and get a sense of what that meant and what it means to be an officer there, and what it means to be incarcerated there. And so today, I'm going to start off as I did the past two. By the way, I'm Andrew Clark, and I direct the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at UConn. And we are co-hosting these webinars with the Tau Youth Justice Institute. Noticed Erica Nowakowski was on earlier, but I don't see her now, so I'll just do the welcome from both of our institutes. And again, thank you so much for joining us in this exploration, this conversation that we are having today. And so I started it off, and I'll do that again today, with just a brief overview of the system. The numbers, taking a look just for comparative purposes, and then I'm going to hand it off to Per Våge and Per Omdal to explain more about their system to us. And then we'll have a moderated conversation led by CT Public's Jacqueline Rob Thomas. So I'm going to start now by sharing my screen. So as I mentioned, this is the part 3, the rights of the child. This is a familiar slide. It's just the Norwegian population statistics and prison locations. As we learned in the previous webinars, Norway is roughly 2 million, a population of 2 million larger than in Connecticut here. And the median age is roughly the same. The gender breakdown is roughly the same. And the difference in how they describe their demographics and collect information is really they don't use and utilize race and ethnicity. They use a Norwegian, European, and other. One of the things too about this slide that we learned is Norway has more prisons than we do in Connecticut, but they're smaller and they're located closer to where the inmates are from originally. And here we have Connecticut. This is from a map of all of the facilities that we had here at one point. We're now down a few, but this is from the Connecticut Department of Correction website. And here's some of the statistics that I shared in past sessions on the population. And again, our demographics, which we do break down into race and ethnicity. And we'll be able to share these slides with participants following the webinar. So just look out for your emails for these so you can see them and look at them more closely. One of the reasons why we're looking at Norway is because if you look at the prison rates, they have really one of the smallest in the world, 54 per 100,000. And when you look at 737 individuals incarcerated per 100,000 in the US, Connecticut, we've had a diminished population, especially over the past couple of years. We're now down to 278. We were at roughly 400 at one point, 400 individuals. individuals for every 100,000. But on the flip side, someone may ask, all right, so they incarcerate fewer, but if they're not safer, then what's the point of that? Well, as we understand and we know from exploring the system in Norway, that it is a relatively safer general public, and the individuals who come out of the system are better off, generally speaking, than those that come out of the system in the US. By better off, I mean they go on to be productive members of society and don't necessarily come back into the system as frequently as they do here in Connecticut, where over the span of 3 to 5 years, individuals that come out of our prisons are likely to be rearrested at a rate of around 70% and reincarcerated at a rate of about 50%. Compare that with Norway, where we're looking at less than 20% reincarcerated after 3 years. So now we're going to talk a little bit, and these are new, and I want to thank in particular Gwen Ross, who's interning with us this summer from the University of Chicago, who helped put these together for us. These are some juvenile statistics or youth or child statistics for Connecticut and Norway. Connecticut averages the juvenile prison population of 66 in 2021. That's 66 incarcerated. That means 9 per 100,000 minors in Connecticut is incarcerated. Compare that with Norway. The juvenile prison population at the moment is 3. Again, think about that with a population of 5 million. That means 0.24 per 100,000 minors in Norway is incarcerated, which means when you do the math, children in Connecticut are imprisoned at a rate 37.5 times the rate that they are. Now we look at the age breakdown. In Connecticut, children under 15 over the age of 10 and older can be tried in juvenile court. In Norway, children under 15 are not criminally responsible. So you will not find a child under 15 in the criminal justice system in Norway. In the case of children between the ages of 15 and 17, in Connecticut, felony cases may be transferred to the adult court. Class A, that means Class A felonies, and most Class B are, as well as arson and murder, is done automatically. The ages of 15 to 7 in Norway, we'll find out more about this. They're tried in the adult court, but they receive the youth punishment. We'll learn more about that. And over the age of 17, in Connecticut, you're considered an adult and tried in adult court. And in Norway, you are also considered an adult and tried in adult court. As we learned in the past too, that is a little bit different how they do it there for the adults as well. But we're going to focus on the child, and in particular, the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, which we'll learn had a real impactful meaning on what happened in Norway several decades ago now. And Article 3.1 of that convention states that in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. And Article 37 says the arrest, detention, or imprisonment of a child shall be in conformity with the law and shall be used only as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. And Norway ratified the rights of the child in 1991. The United States is an outlier here and has not done so, and Connecticut does not follow that treaty. What happens in pretrial custody of juveniles in Connecticut versus Norway? In Connecticut, predisposition average length of stay was 23 days in 2021. There were 43 juveniles who were held 60 or more days in predisposition. In Norway, court-ordered custody is only possible when there are no other alternatives. A fixed length of time must be set that there are no more than 2 weeks in pretrial, and this can be extended by the court on request of the prosecutor for 2 weeks at a time. Connecticut juvenile sentences are handled by special juvenile courts. The average juvenile secure treatment stay in Connecticut, that's secure within a secure facility, was 190.6 days in 2021. And all sentences in 2021 were over 60 days, and it occurs in a juvenile institution. And here's a picture, and we're going to see some of the Norwegian, but here's a picture of the juvenile detention center in Hartford. And the region, which is a secure program, the region's programs for boys in Hamden. The Connecticut adult sentences for children 15 or old who have committed felonies may be sentenced by an adult court. Those who have committed Class A or B felonies are automatically transferred, as I mentioned previously. They are held at Manson Youth Institution, a high security facility for men under 21, and York Correctional Institution, our only female correctional institution, and it's a high security women's prison. Manson Youth, as we know, is those of us who have been paying attention to the justice system in Connecticut, has been found by the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to violate the 8th and 14th Amendments and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It also failed to provide appropriate mental health, according to the report, mental health care to children. The constitutional violation specifically involved solitary confinement of children. And we'll talk about that more later from the Connecticut perspective. Here's some pictures of Manson Youth in Cheshire, Connecticut. Norwegian youth sentences. Prison sentences are only given when especially necessary for children. The maximum is a 15-year sentence. Only one child has ever been sentenced to preventive detention, which we don't have here in Connecticut. Sentences served in youth units transferred to adult units when they turn 18, similar to what we do in Connecticut, although it's only 21. Alternative youth penalty for moderately serious crimes served at home with frequent follow-up meetings, and an option to transfer a sentenced child to a child care institution. And here's a picture that we had of an adult cell in the I can't pronounce it, I won't even try, prison in Norway. And that's the end of my presentation. And what I'm going to do now is hopefully that provides some overview of the systems in a comparative sense. Now I'm going to stop sharing that and bring on Per Våge and Per Omdal. Per Sigurd Våge is the director of the Correctional Service of Norway since graduating from law studies in 1984. He has been a professional practitioner in the governmental field of justice in various roles as a prosecutor, a judge, a lawyer in the police, prison governor, and since 2001, the regional director in the Correctional Service. From 2019 to 2021, he was stationed in a bilateral mission in Kyiv, Ukraine, as international expert in rule of law, enhancing the Ukrainian probation service. In all leading roles of management development, rule of law, and security, he has been innovative and motivated to enhance the organization towards evidence-based methods and best practices. That's something consistent with what we've been trying to do here in Connecticut as well, move towards best practices and evidence-based methods. His priority and perspective has been strong on each individual person serving their sentences in the measure of stability to the social contract of each government in office. Per Sigurd is a person with an optimistic and curious mindset in his professional and private life. And I can vouch for that in the few conversations that we've had over Zoom here. Simply, frankly, cold calling him and saying that we were putting together these series. He has been nothing but graceful and generous with his time. This is my first time meeting his compatriot, Per Omdal. Pleasure to meet you. He's the former leader of the youth unit in the Bjorgden prison, and a lawyer in the Correctional Service, and a project leader for the development and implementation of the first modern youth unit in Norway. From 2019, he has been a department director of the National Office for Health Service Appeals, responsible for the professional standards and enhancing the development of the law and practice in the agency. Welcome. Would you like me to start the slideshow?
Yes, please. We'll try. This is a picture of the juvenile unit in Bergen. It's a very old building from the time when we had great big facilities for retarded people, and that was a reform that was ended in the start of the 1990s. We took this building from the other agencies and started building it like a prison in one of the similar buildings next door. But this house was not in use until the need of a juvenile unit was raised by the Minister of Justice around 2006. And that's my starting point of my presentation, because this just a minute before we continue this one, the minister, he said quite openly, and also it was based on the political resolution from that government at the time, that they did not want children to be put in prison. So it was a political agenda, and this was supported not only by the judicial politicians, but also from the child care, the social care, the education, the health, the community sector, and the international, so to say, the foreign ministry, following up the international standards Norway was obliged to follow. So that was a challenge to us in the correctional service, how to build a new kind of prison based on those political resolutions. He said it should not look like a prison. It should not be connected with adult prisoners. And we should serve these children, if they had to be put in prison, in a completely different way that we had done. So our time back from a similar situation most countries and agencies are in is not very far away, only like 15 years. The next, please. And then this new approach was also supplied with other legislation tasks done in the same period. And by 2014, we got a new law on mediation for the youngest kids, also mentioned briefly by Andrew in the beginning today. And we also had an opening for more use of the probation service as well. In addition to this, the childcare had to sharpen their ways of handling the most difficult kids while they were in the childcare units, and because they kind of developed in a direction where the facilities in the childcare looked more and more like a prison with guards, and they did not have the follow-up and caretaking of the children that the politicians were kind of supporting. This mediation legislation has been working now for 8 years, and maybe Per, my colleague Per, and we just call each other Per as long as we're in the same room. It's no problem. So easy. But there has been different experiences with this mediation and also the probation. So if you can say just a few words about that.
Yeah, I think one of the most important reasons that this law came into 2014, I think it was out of the UN Convention on the Right of the Child, because prisons should be, as you mentioned, a measure of a last resort, and the politicians they were very eager to try to find ways to keep these youth out of prison, but within a secure system. So both the youth punishment and the youth follow-up was measures in that way. And I would say at least up until 2019, 2020, and perhaps after that also, it has been a success. We have managed to keep many youth out of prisons because of this system. still some commit so serious crime that this doesn't support their needs. So we have to keep them in a secure place, keep them in a facility that can secure the society around them for a period of time.
Okay, and then we will go back to the building, the facility in itself. On the next slide, please. You could imagine this old kind of institution building that we had to use to build this unit. It's large, and it should only house 4 people, 4 youngsters. We were in contact with professors in architecture, and they had contact with colleagues from other countries. We also looked at architecture from other countries, among them Germany and England, and we didn't find any good enough for our purpose. But the starting point was that the building must support the purpose and the function of the execution of the punishments in the prison. So, for instance, we went to the child care agencies and asked them whether it was a meaning for the youngsters if the floor was made of wood or if it was concrete or any other materials. And they said, of course, it's important for the kids to grow up or to live 24/7 on a wooden floor. The same with decorations, the same with the special colors that we chose, the same with the size of the windows. So we started with the building, and we paid a lot of attention to the design, which we tried to achieve during this first period of preparation. I don't know, Per, if you want to add something. You used the buildings for the next years, but and what was your experience with the house itself and the building and
perhaps the first thing that we heard when these young people came to the facility, to the building, was that they said, more of them, several of them said that I really don't deserve this. I've come to prison. I don't deserve this wooden floor. I don't deserve these nice furnitures, and so on. And that was exactly what we tried to create, something else, because they were brought into a system, a quite rigid system, but we wanted to show them that this is something else. We are building something that is in a way going to satisfy their needs, and we want to show them that. So we were a bit worried in the beginning if they would destroy it, crash the sofas and so on, but they didn't. They really respected the building. They respected everything inside. So we had a very low cost on repairing the building.
Okay, the other aspect that was important in the beginning of this design was the need of flexibility for the areas. So we could go from a large area space in the prison, and if the situation changed quickly, we could easily adjust the areas, all to save or to preserve a safe and calm gathering for the rest of the people inside, including the personnel. Mm-hmm. So if you take the next slide, we started with this as a ruin, and we wanted to build a lighthouse for the future that the world never had seen. So then the next thing, and we think we succeeded so far. So, but then back to the juveniles themselves. Who are they? And then the next slide, please, with the pictures. Yes. So Per, if you can say who you met in the beginning.
Yes, because we saw quite a development in who these youth were. In the beginning, when we opened in 2009, most of the youths, the juveniles, they were boys. They came from gangs, especially from the eastern part of Norway. So we had to create a building that could separate these juveniles who were friends from each other when they were in prison, because at that time we only had one juvenile unit in Norway. So the building had to take care that we could separate them. The largest picture, that's a group of young people in the southern part of Norway who committed serious crime. There were bus robberies, armed bank robberies, and quite a lot of them. The picture up on the left is from Oslo. These 16 and 17-year-olds robbed telephones and money from the 12-year-olds in Oslo. Quite a high number of criminal activities. And then in 2014, 2015, the crime became much more serious when we saw the first murder. A 15-year-old girl killed a social worker in an institution. And in fact, we didn't expect to get this low age on our juveniles, and especially not from the girls. So that was the second wave we saw around 2014, 2015. Instead of receiving young boys from gangs with violence, threats, robberies, well-functioning cognitively, history with drug abuse and so on, we received these girls who was, in a way, individual criminals, not related to gangs. They came in because of serious crime, murder, arson, serious threats. They were not so well functioning cognitively. They have no history with drug abuse. Because of the serious crime, they stayed in prison for a long time. And instead of talking about this angry young man, which we saw for the first 5 or 6 years, we now saw this sick young women, so to speak, who had big needs of health care, and we could, in a way, explain their behavior out of their health needs.
So if we just flip to two PowerPoints further on, yes, just go on further to the picture of the brain, please. Go on. We wanted to be aware of what are the challenges, here we are, for the human beings themselves coming to us. So we were all experienced with male prisoners, both Per and me, for a long time. We have worked together for more than 15 years in the correctional service, and I have been more than 20. And it's a kind of disease when you get fond of working in this sector. I'm sorry. But then we had new challenges. We needed the knowledge and competence of psychology. And we went to the University of Bergen, and they were very close related to us for a long time and still are. And they learned us a lot about the child brain development. And we have to share this knowledge to all of the employees in the youth unit. So there is a reason why they should not adapt or in a way react to the children in a prison the way that they have learned to do with grown-ups in an adult prison. So that's the need of knowledge of quite specific elements of the development of youth. And that gives us also a more sense why children should always be treated very differently from grown-ups. And I'm sorry that the age limit in this kind of development of the brain does not stop at the age of 18. So therefore, Norway has also a program running nowadays to see the challenges we have with a group of inmates between 18 and 25. So it's a difficult story with the youngest criminals. If we don't treat them differently, they will become more or less role model of their own mirroring. So they look at themselves as grown-ups. They look at themselves as angry and can behave just without any rules and so on. And this continues at least until they are 30, if they're not challenged and taught how to behave as part of their natural development. So then the next slide, how do we work in this development, in this unit? And the starting point that Per will tell more about is connected to the UN Convention of Children.
Yes, and again, we use, of course, prison only for as a measure of the last resort. So that was one thing we have spoken about already. And the next one was when they end up in prison, our job was to keep them there for the shortest period of time. So we had to know what we were doing, and we had to deal with changes within the juvenile group. And we had to find a method to work with the juveniles as best as we could, and we knew that their behavior was related to their health and development with the cognitively skills, and so to speak. So the next slide, please. So we had to know what works. We knew that punishment in itself is not the path to change. So just by closing the doors and keep them in a house for 2 years doesn't change anything. It doesn't receive the risk of them doing crime or unaccepted behavior again. So it is what we do while they're in the juvenile unit that matters. And of course, accidental interventions, giving them positive feedback on their football skills or their skills in cooking and so on, is good because they got some positive experience, but that didn't necessarily reduce the risk of new crime, which were our main goal. So we had to assess them. We had to look for risk factors to reduce the risk of new crime. And when we had done that, we had to establish some measures, some activities while they were followed up by the juvenile unit, measures both to work while they were in the prison, and we had to see that this was continued after the release when they were in the society. So if we go to the next slide. So the method, we cooperate quite closely with the health agency in this one, and also with the childcare agency. And the method we found was the best was the so-called R&R model, the risk-need responsivity model. In short terms, I'm not sure you're probably familiar with this, but the risk element is that we only work with those with the highest risk. So the most serious crime, that was the people we received in the juvenile unit. We had to assess them, we had to find their needs. So that meant that instead of the juveniles, the prisoners, they had to adjust to the system had to adjust to their needs. So we put everything upside down, and of course that was took a lot of resources to manage to go through. And the last, the R, the responsivity, was that what we did, we have to make sure that it worked on each individual juvenile, because it wasn't automatically that what worked on one juvenile worked on the other one. So we had to also assess the cognitive skills to see what worked on everyone. And in addition, we worked after the principles of milieu therapy in the facilities.
Yeah, I'll come back to more of the experiences, but but we have tried to deliver better persons out of the prisons than they came to us. So by using this multi-agency model that Norway has as a general rule running all prisons, and this was presented in the first of your webinars by Thomas Ugelvik, that is extended concerning these young inmates. So the amount of education is much higher and much more individual. The amount of a child, the presence of a child care counselor was there all the time, as well as we had 2 psychologists which were or who were working with these people, both in a milieu therapeutic way and also in a cognitive and individual therapeutic way. We also had special competence among the staff, where we had a mix of prison officers, 50-50 with milieu therapeutes who were their competence came from the colleges and not from the prison school, and they had usually experience from teaching and childcare and many other backgrounds. So and then we also used a lot of time to engage the communities where they lived permanently to make them their home city, their home community responsible for them when we could release them from prison as quickly as possible. So so this was the task, and we tried to develop this method in practical issues the best we could. And we feel that we have a good conscious and we did the time the best that we were able to do with the resources that were available. And then we can say something more about the risk factors. Per was just mentioning it, and we have just a few slides here, not to explain you what we did concerning the risk, but just to show you how important this element was, especially close to the release. So if you just go from the first to the second, this is done. This is work done by the psychologist. You can also take the next one. They explained everyone what they were doing, how they were doing it, and how this was in a way the procedures of this risk assessment. And then the last one. Next one, and this is by Stephen Hart, who has been close to us in the development in the correctional service in Bergen for a long time. So he says that it's a difficult future forecast for humans, but we have done the best we can with the best people that we have been able to get hold of. So then we can go through the pictures, and maybe Per has been practical leader of this unit can flash us through the pictures, and you'll see how it looks like from the inside.
Yeah, and here we start from the outside. So we wanted to create the big outdoor area. So they have a garden, they have area to play and to be active. This was also where they did their gymnastics while they're in school. So everything happened on the inside and this area outside the prison. So maybe just go for the next picture. This is just a walk through the building. This was the personal entrance. So this was not where the juveniles had access. You can just go quickly against now. And this was the reception area. This was the room the juveniles saw the first, and this was also where we did the visits mainly. So this is separated from the common areas in the building. So we can just continue. This is just a visiting area. It was also used as a classroom, one teacher, one student. You can just Continue. Yeah, this is storage room, not so exciting, but you see the wooden floor. This was the room for the drug control. We saw that this could be a bit of a problem when we received the girls, so we had to treat them differently, but we also managed that. So we can just continue. And this is the area where our 4 cells or the 4 rooms, we call them rooms, not cells, but they didn't have common walls. So if we had noise in one room, hopefully they wouldn't hear it in the neighbor room. So there were some spaces between each of the 4 rooms. And again, this wooden floor and the colors. And this is the picture of inside the cell or inside the room. Again, large windows, much daylight in. We tried to furniture them as normal as we could. And quite big size. We can just continue. With normal bathrooms, it was discussed whether we should have steel toilets, but we decided we didn't want that. We wanted to have a normal, and that worked really well. So they get this sense of normality. And again, this is a picture of the hall with 4 rooms from one side to another, with the kitchen area and the living room in the middle. And it was possible to close them into 3 parts if that was necessary to keep it calm, or if we had different levels of the security, which we in periods also had. So we can just continue. This is the kitchen area. The juveniles were expected to take part in preparing all meals, both, and we also use this as in the education for the students. So they made their cooking lessons here. This is also the same area with the art on the walls. Just continue. This is a leisure area, recreation, where we have table tennis and again a little bit more art. And this was one of the classrooms. Normally just 1 student, 1 teacher in this room. You can just continue. And again, the separate kitchen for juveniles. This is where, when we received our first girl, this was where she lived. So she had her own kitchen, her own room, and was separated from the other boys who were juveniles at that time. And of course, that became also a problem over time, because she was isolated a lot from them. And this is the observation room. If we need to isolate them, the juveniles, for longer periods, we could keep them here, no risk for them harming themselves. So this is a bit more like a normal cell, except from the wooden floor. And we can just continue. I think we're also through. This was the isolation cell. And here you have the steel toilet. So this is again more like a normal prison facility. We can just continue to the administration.
But even here we kept the wooden floor.
Yeah, and this was where all the interagency was placed. Both the school, the psychologists, the child welfare advisor, and so on was kept side by side. So it was very easy to discuss on a daily basis every juvenile who were there, and make plans. And then we have a picture of this was before the halfway house was finished, but in this room, which was a 2-room flat, the juveniles could live for the last period in the juvenile unit and go to school outside the prison, go to activities outside the prison, but live here and prepare them for the release, and then try to introduce the normality as best as we could. And for the last picture, I think, was the apartment for family for visitors, 3 bedrooms, and here the families could come and stay for the weekend, make meals, and spend a lot of time with the juveniles for the weekends.
Yeah. And then the last one.
And the last one is the outdoor area again.
Yeah.
Oh,
Just flip next one, please.
yes, and this is just from the inside and the outdoor area.
Those traffic signs you can see as a background, it's were given to us free from the road authorities, and it's not possible to climb that. And it also gives the youth an idea of choosing, which we have to do in the traffic all the time. So it's there is an idea behind that that kind of fence. Okay, and then the next one, maybe you can remember this picture.
Oh, this is a long time ago.
So, but it's about the media. They were very interested in what was going on in this new unit. And I was the regional director, and I thought it was nice to let the newspapers and media come to this unit, because it belongs to all of us in Norway. It's not ours in the correctional service, but it's a part of all the society, and therefore we should not hide it but share it, because it's a lot of dilemmas, it's a lot of difficulties. And here Per is sitting next to the childcare advisor.
And it was and still is highly controversial, keeping children in prison in Norway.
Yeah, and still is. As the end of it, we can say, how much does it cost? It costs every day 7.5 times more than an ordinary place in the prison. So it's expensive, but since it's not that much amount of money, since the level of youth in prison is very low, then it's not very expensive for the society as a whole. We have a prison of a very high degree standard in Norway, but we don't use more money on it than we need to do it. To build up this and to also help us in the future research, that's a number of or a list of names from Norway and from Canada, who have and still do a lot of support and give us a lot of critics if they find things to criticize, and we have to be humble that we have to do the best for the time we are living, not for the past that we have experienced. But we also have to be flexible for the future and follow up new circumstances which can affect us to always do the best we can, especially for the youngest. And remember that when we invest this kind of care in prison for the youngsters, just saving one of them for a criminal life. Of course, we save his life or her life, but we also save a very high amount of money for the society. If they can be stopped or being reduced in their kind of development as a criminal youngsters, that's a good investment ever. It's much better than the stock exchange. Yeah. I could say the last slide here is that Norway has a good cooperation with America. We have had for many years, and it's gone through this company called Amend. It's Professor Bree Williams who is in charge of this connection with us. For the time being, we are working with the states of California, Oregon, Washington, and North Dakota. And the main purpose is to influence the staff, the prison staff, and focus on their health effects caused by the fact that they work in a prison. And we hope that their way of behaving and thinking and acting will also influence the inmates in a long term. So this work is going on further west in America. So by that we can stop our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pairs. It was really informative. And just as a little side note, we're going to look to continue these conversations and hopefully bring on the folks from Amend and maybe even see if we can partner with them here in Connecticut. But I know we have about 35 minutes left of scheduled time. And I also know that I believe Per Omdal might have to leave in about 15, 20 minutes. And so I do want to get going with the panelists who I'm sure are chomping at the bits to ask some questions, talk about the system we have here relative to there, maybe explore a little bit more. So I'm going to just introduce them and as well as the moderator, I'll briefly introduce them with their bios and then I'll put more in the chat as well. So first we have Hope Metcalf, who's the executive director of the Orville Shell Junior Center for International Human Rights Law and co-teaches in the Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic at Yale Law School. In January 2017, she helped launch the Peter Gruber Rule of Law Clinic, and she directed from 2010 to 2014 the Lyman Program at Yale Law School. A tremendous background in human rights. And in particular, also more recently has been working with Stop Solitary that helped recently pass a new law that brings back the prison ombudsman in a new location with a council that helps to oversee that. So welcome, Attorney Metcalf. We also have Dr. Danielle Cooper with us, who is an associate professor of criminal justice and director of research at the Tau Youth Justice Institute at the University of New Haven. She conducts research in the areas of youth and young adults, juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, criminological theory, and sex offending. Through her work in the community, she has collaborated with key stakeholders such as youth and their parents, law enforcement, mental health professionals, and youth serving organizations. And we know her very well here at the AMRP from a lot of things, but most recently her assistance with students with the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Cooper. Thirdly, we have Heather Panciera, who joined the Office of the Child Advocate in December 2001. Heather serves as the lead for the OCA on matters related to children, youth, and young adults in residential facilities and congregate care settings, including investigating concerns regarding the provision of state-funded services and supports. She advocates both for the individual needs of children, youth, and young adults, and for necessary systemic reforms to help these systems to be more effective, efficient, and accountable. Sounds familiar. Prior to joining to OCA, Heather worked for 10 years at the Department of Children and Families, and she holds a bachelor's degree from UConn School of Family Studies. And this is, I believe, although probably we've crossed paths because we've been in government for about the same amount of time, the first time really meeting Heather, but we're very fortunate to have her here. Welcome, Heather. And lastly, as a panelist, we have Brittany Lamar. Brittany has really helped to spearhead these webinars, and we're thankful for that. In the midst of that, and we started working with her as a student here at UConn, she was brought on to the Tau Youth Justice Institute in this past April. And so she's now the project manager for the JJPOC, the Juvenile Justice Policy and Oversight Committee, the legislative body that works to reform the juvenile justice system. She has a strong background in juvenile justice issues and as well as experience in the areas of policy advancement and engaging multiple stakeholders. She's got a really tremendous background working with youth, putting herself out there, getting involved. She's, I think, probably getting 3 or 4 degrees at the same time right now, including her law degree. Her master's was in the National Guard. And has participated in webinars, in particular in the fall with us here on the youth car theft issue. And finally, we have, well, good morning, Ms. Lamar. Finally, we have Jacqueline Robb Thomas, who's going to be our moderator. And Jacqueline was the Connecticut Mirror's education and housing reporter. We actually had Jacqueline as a moderator at the beginning of the pandemic when we started our whole Zoom world here, moderating a panel on health outcomes and health disparities as we were looking at health disparities within prison during the pandemic and how individuals within prison were treated differently during the pandemic than they were outside. And such a tremendous voice in the media world here in Connecticut. She was an original member of the Connecticut Mirror staff, joining shortly before their 2010 launch. And her awards include the Best of Show Theater Driscoll Investigative Award from the Connecticut Society of Professional Journalists in 2019. And again, a lot of background in health and healthcare, education, and prisons, and now is at CT Public, where she actually moderated a youth forum last night in Glastonbury. So welcome, everybody. I can say so much more about you, but I just thank you all for being here, and I'll now pass it over to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for being here. We just heard a really powerful presentation about conditions of confinement in Norway, and we heard about the work that is being done to prevent confinement there. I'd like to start with Heather and to hear a little bit about the work that you have done. If you could just sort of set the stage that the work that your office has done about what is the system like here in Connecticut.
So our office has a statutory obligation to review, investigate, and report on the conditions of confinement for youth incarcerated in Connecticut in our detention facilities and, in our adult system. So we've been doing that, if I can remember, probably since 2015-16, but I could be wrong. So, and part of that is going into the facilities, right? We have a pretty specific methodology of what we're looking at. We have access to the facilities, we have access to the youth and to the staff. So we spend a lot of time looking at the conditions within the facilities, discharge planning, treatment that's happening when they're there, and really all of that from that holistic view of what the confinement looks like and also what the discharge planning looks like, and I would say, that was a really powerful presentation, right, that we just heard about really thinking about the needs of the youth, right? And I think most specifically is how, when they talked about the youth in Connecticut and probably in the United States, they do have to adjust to the system. The system isn't adjusting to them, right? And we focus so much on a building and not on the needs. So the kids really are put into the system. And we've really focused on that, Jackie, and how they have to really, they're not, we like to say we try to treat them as children, right? We try to change stuff, but the reality is it's an adult system with adult policies and staff. And in order to kind of change is what Norway is talking about, you really have to turn that upside down, which is what they said. And it's hard to do that when you have everything in a very small contained setting. And we find that, as the DOJ did as well, some of the concerns about education, access to mental health services, and really how the needs of the kids are being met or not, and how that actually affects their living conditions inside the walls and really how they adjust when they leave.
So with that being said, could you just spell out, Hope, what the gold standard is, or even what sort of the floor should be about what we should be providing youth who do get into trouble and need help, getting back on the right path? What is sort of the standard that we should be living by here in Connecticut and in the US, in your view?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think really the floor should be what the Conventions on the Rights of the Child says, right? So human rights are a starting point. Those are the most basic rights that countries have come together and agreed on that every person deserves. And in the case of children, what the standard is we've seen how that can be embodied in a particular place in Norway in that instance. So that means essentially, to my mind, the floor and the starting point is what Norway is doing. That's not a luxury. That is the starting point. And just to make a couple of things, I really want to emphasize that the standard that is set forth in the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that says detention must be a last resort and for the shortest time possible. That is such a strange concept to us in the United States. It's so hard for us to wrap our minds around. And I'll say I've been doing work in prisons for about 12 years locally. I've been doing human rights for about 20 years. It wasn't until honestly maybe 6-7 years ago that I could really internalize what that means. Okay, no, there is a very different way of conceiving of the function of prisons. And we need to really radically think about what we want them to do for us. And are they doing what we want them to do? Are they serving both the children and also adults, I would add, because I work mostly with adults. Are they serving the people who go there, and therefore are they serving all of us? Because of course, virtually everyone comes home. So the simple answer, I think, is that what we've heard is the minimum. And that's what we not only should be striving for, that's what we need to do.
Per Erik Omdal and Per Sigurd Våge, and I apologize if I completely botched your name, which I'm sure I did, so I'm really sorry. Could you just talk a little bit about how you got to the place where you are? Was there pushback? When I'm hearing some of the standards that you've put in place, huge flags are being raised in my mind about just the politics of being able to get such changes across the finish line. Did you face that in Norway to make such changes, or was it widely embraced?
We faced a lot of pushback because a lot of wise persons said that we should not put people in prison under age of 18, no matter what. So that was one side of the horizon. The other hawks, they said, put everyone who do something wrong in prison and let's fill up and build more and more cells, even for youngsters, and let them feel the pain and the suffering. But when you get a political direction pointed out from a Minister of Justice, that is very strong, and you can, in a way, as I was the regional director, I said, okay, if he says and orders me to do so, I have to do it. But I must say, by that time, I had 5 other colleagues in Norway, and they did not do the same effort to make this happen that we did in the Region West. So there is something with the crew that I was surrounded with and I collected, and we wanted to do this, but we wanted to do it very, very high quality. So if we couldn't do it with a high price, high quality, and then we would return this order and say we can't do it properly. So then we think that could be for others to do it. But then when we got this opportunity with the resources to build a nice facility, to create a new staff with the right competence, to get open gates into the child care, to the health service, to the education and all other places, they were all collected on the minister level. And that was in a way, it got down into the systems, into the regions and to the local administrators and managers that I was cooperating with. So then it was easy for Per and other colleagues of his to cooperate on the individual level. But it's quite a difficult matter of management and leadership, I would say, and seen backwards. So
One
yeah.
of the figures that were shared at the beginning by Andrew about just the rate of incarceration in Norway compared to Connecticut and the US really were jarring. And I've heard so often that we really need to get to the root causes to improve situations for children. And that so often that we are criminalizing poverty here. And I'm curious, Brittany, if you could just talk a little bit about that pipeline into incarceration for youth and potential solutions to sever that.
Sure. So I think in Norway, the individuals from Norway spoke on this, and I think, I've heard it in, in various deliberations on bills and public testimony. I think it's well known that there are root issues that drive young people into the system. I think we understand that there's things like housing insecurity, economic insecurity, food insecurity, different, traumas and experiences that young people face that ultimately contribute to their contact with the system. And I think in Norway, they do a great job of putting of creating that intention behind what they're doing in the spaces that they're housing young people, those high risk needs young people who may need to be placed somewhere else to be serviced and directly serviced, to intentionally identify those needs, work directly with the young people on those needs, and then have a well transitioned and well-rounded comprehensive plan to slowly make that transition back into the community, and create a successful plan. I think one thing that they just mentioned that I want to comment on is that a lot of that came from, one, the rights of the child, but having that leadership, and in conversations with Per Våge, that his leadership and coming from the top down on, this is what we need to embrace, this is what we need to do. I feel we're in a place in Connecticut and in the United States where we're trying to do this from the bottom up. We have advocacy efforts. We have groups coming saying this is what we need to embrace, where are those in positions of power, this is not coming from them. So it's kind of an uphill battle here versus, it coming from the top down.
Dr. Cooper, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you are seeing does work here in Connecticut to help youth.
I would just point out, it's just in alignment with Brittany's comments, that it's really so multi-layered, the ways that we are both seeing the problem, trying to identify the solutions and the supports that it takes. And so, I've been here in the state of Connecticut since 2015. I do think that part of what we hear from the presentation about Norway is a clear intent, a shift in language, a shift in resources. And that's not an easy battle, but monthly we have the Juvenile Justice Policy Oversight Committee, which is dozens of committed individuals in leadership positions trying to figure out what are the next steps about getting it right. And in many states, we don't actually have that constant thump of conversation, of criticism, of new thought. And so just even having that space, but literally the people who make up that space are, once again, many of the leaders that we want to be the change makers and that we want to be the leading thought agents, also committed to social emotional learning, restorative practices, the way that we saw how Norway not only acknowledges that there's a future for the child as a youngster. I love that. There's a future for the youngster, but that in the space that is correction, right? That there's opportunity for still acknowledging their humanness completely while acknowledging that their behavior is something that can be shifted, is something that can be changed. And so that seemed to be on both like a body, like acknowledging the space, acknowledging the quality of life of those young people. And once again, in terms of like things that we're working on here in the state of Connecticut, we're constantly asking ourselves, what does it mean where we house young people? We've made the shifts to shut down what was the youth prison, the Connecticut Juvenile Training School. I believe that took place in about 2017 is when we saw that go into place. We've now got youth in smaller, more residential facilities, but they're not just for, right? And so, you know, when we hear Hope talk about what are those best practices, and we hear like that, yes, the UN rights of the child, that's a commitment. And we're a state that's doing a lot of things, but all states would benefit by a federal commitment. Like, what does it mean that we have not fully ratified, fully had our president sign those things into law? It means that, once again, we're still having debates about what is our commitment to those best practices fully.
Hope, I see you have your hand up. I'll pivot to you, and I also will ask you a question about when the larger facility, Connecticut Juvenile Training School, was closed several years ago. The intention was to open smaller facilities. The conversation pivoted to just how small those facilities could be, because there was the fear that certain services, if they were too small, certain services would not be able to become available, certain educational services, certain vocational services, therapies, stuff, et cetera. And I'm curious sort of what the balance is for size of said facilities. What's sort of the most humane approach if there is going to be a facility where you do have to remove a child from their community? What should we be aiming for?
So I'm going to politely say I'm not the right person to answer that question. I think that the guideline would be what's in the best interest of the child. And so presumably, if we're talking about a place where a kid is living, it needs to strike a balance between having more of a home-like environment, but also being sure that those services are available. So I'm sorry, I don't have a perfect answer there. The reason why I raised my hand was both to provide a comment and then also hopefully to draw our Norwegian friends into the conversation. And Jackie, this was triggered by something that you raised, which is about the political dynamics that are at play, which I think we really need to name here. And that is when we talk about who gets counted as a child in the United States and who gets detained, we have to talk about race. I mean, we just have to. So, you know, and that's where Andrew started. It hasn't come up in this conversation, but I did want to name it. And so therefore, you know, and we can see this, I could go on with different examples, whether when we talk about, you know, who counts as a victim of gun violence, you know, oftentimes we're going to be focused on white children or children who seem to count as kids, but children in other environments, particularly if they're children of color, somehow in our system, given our history and our continuing racism, they don't count as children, period, full stop. And we've seen this very ugly politics come up this session in Connecticut, where quite a few legislators are actively running on a platform that to further penalize children. So there's a way in which actually we're trying to hold the line right now at where things are. And so to our Norwegian friends, I'm very curious because the advancements that you all have made are just stunning and really inspiring for a country like ours and for a state like ours that is so segregated in terms of race as well as income. I'm curious if you could share with us a little bit more about the politics that are driving the reforms, both how you have gotten there and also how confident are you that you can keep this system as Norway, which is almost in a very homogeneous country historically. How confident are you that you can keep that system the way it is and those communal values as Norway becomes more diverse? Have those issues come up in terms of race, nationality, et cetera, and how is that going?
It's a bit of a hard question, but I think back in 2005, 2006, there was, I think it was really important that there was a political will to do something about this group of inmates, of prisoners. So they had to establish some rooms for juveniles, but they didn't want too many rooms because then they were afraid that too many juveniles would end up in prison. So we had to keep the number low. So we started up with 4 rooms in our unit and added up 6 more rooms 7 years later. So we wanted to keep the numbers low because it was important to give the juveniles calm and peace to work with themselves to create that space for change. So we saw that also they ended up seeing themselves from the inside out. So from being these criminals, these bandits who came in, they slowly changed so they saw their own future. So one example, a journalist asked him when they came and interviewed both us and some of the juveniles, "What are you doing in 5 years?" And he said, "I want to be a carpenter." And this was the guy who was in the bus with this shotgun. And just I met him 5 years later and asked him, "Okay, what are you doing?" "I'm going to school. I'm on my way to being a carpenter." So something changed, and I think it was a combination of this political will, keeping a low number, a will to give the resources to work with each individual and give him the time. So I'm not sure if that was answering your question, but
I can fill in some of it and a little more on the political issue because it's strange. When we started in the beginning of this process, the numbers of inmates under 18 was between 15 and 25, and now it's between 3 and 6, 7 maybe. So it's strange why does these changes occur, and what is happening in a society when you build up an organization like we have told you about. But we have had this vision in the correctional service, which we also have shared with other countries, like building a safe society. We are building safe neighbors when releasing people. So this has been the mindset for all people working in the in the correctional service. But there is also some value elements in our culture, which is understandable for you since we are such close. We have exported a lot of people from Norway in the earlier days to America. And it's strange that the societies have developed quite differently in the last maybe 50 years. But one of the professors I mentioned in my PowerPoint, Jan Jacobsen, he made a small article where he says that exclusion of people from a society brutalizes, while inclusion will make people participate, and participation is calming human beings and opponents, and also feeling a membership in the public society, which we try to implement what we have told you about this multi-agency process, as well as pushing some kind of responsibility to the inmates, no matter how old they are, could maybe make them feel worth more than just being a number or a warehouse stored person in a prison, like passive.
To speak about those services, we have a question from Representative Robin Porter. She's a state representative here in Connecticut representing New Haven. Representative Porter, would you like to ask your question about some of those services in Norway?
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you all for this presentation and conversation. Absolutely impressed with what Norway is doing. It really makes my heart just swell. I wish we could get it here in Connecticut like yesterday. Some of my concerns, because I do work with Heather with MYI, and I've been in to visit those young people that are being incarcerated. Could you just speak to, because it seems like you guys have a one-to-one school curriculum. You say one teacher, one youth that's been incarcerated. Can you just talk about that? And also, I'm curious about the outcomes, but you pretty much spoke to it. You guys are having phenomenal outcomes when it comes to what you're doing.
It is correct. In this education situation, we have more as one-to-one if that's what's needed, because their education skill was so different. So we could have a 17-year-old that was cognitively on a 6-year-old stadium, and then we had to adjust the education to that. So when we started out, we quite rapidly saw that we had to adjust the education to where each student were. And luckily we had the cooperation with the schools, and they also saw that, and also by law they were in a way obliged to give them what they needed at the time. And of course the speed was also quite different, so they didn't they went through their education more rapidly than they would in a school situation outside the prison, of course. But they started up where the student needs were.
Thank you for that.
We had a question from the audience about, could our friends from Norway please expand on the services that families receive in the community to support their incarcerated youth and to prepare the youth for their return home?
Well, you see, all governmental services like social security, schools, ordinary health is free. Even schools, including the universities, are free. You have to pay for your own living expenses in universities, that's all. But it's a quite different situation from most countries, I would say. So if a family has a criminal child, they are, if needed, they can go to the social service office and explain their needs. For instance, if they have to travel to a prison to go to visit him, they will be given support for that kind of need. But it is individual and specific for each family, each situation.
Heather, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation, talking about the needs of youth. In the work that your office does, could you just talk a little bit about potential gaps that exist to help with that transition back into the community, and to keep recidivism rates low?
Whew, that's tough, Jackie. You know, I think that when you think about the needs of these kids and listening to everyone talk, I mean, these kids have been so underserved for such a long period of time. And then we're putting them into a system that is taxed already and really is trying to change everything about the system to meet their needs. And sort of to Robin's question about, you know, the one-to-one, right? Some of these kids are at a level, they've been out of school for years, right? They're disengaged and their needs are enormous. And unless we can, right, meeting their needs in the setting is crucially important in a humane, you know, way that they can actually be comfortable learning and really learn how to live in a community together instead of community containment, which is sort of what happens in prison. And I think that, you know, the gaps they're huge in terms of kids being discharged, whether they're sentenced or not, and having the communities really be ready to, you know, accept them back and support them. You know, so some of the stuff that we heard about, like the apartment, you know, that they're doing in Norway, I mean, for kids to actually have access to something that they can feel good about, for having the community embrace them coming back, instead of, I think what most of these kids feel is the complete opposite. You know, the communities aren't prepared to have them home. You know, they don't have their needs met. So they're going to go, you know, how do you have the community do that for them? You know, it has to be an inside outside, you know, strategy. And it just doesn't work like that. And, you know, people may say, well, it's a lot easier when, you know, Norway only has 3 kids. Well, you know, if you look at, we have the capacity, if you have people actually getting together, you know, to make sure that we understand, you know, how vulnerable these kids are and how vulnerable they have been and their families, right? So I'm going off on a tangent, but it's like that generational stuff that we don't talk about, like Hope was saying. We have to have that conversation. And I think communities also need to understand, right, that in order to have your community safe, we have to have these guys and girls be successful, right, on the inside and then coming out. And that we have to be honest about that. And I think really embrace that in a way that we don't do, you know, because whether it's the conversation or people really not understanding what those needs are. And so it's really, you know, it's tough, but we have to, you know, they're all coming home. All these kids are going back into their communities. And that's just a fact, right? And normally sooner than later. So, I don't know, that may not answer your question.
It does. The last question I'll send to our friends from Norway. I'm curious about sort of the public narrative about how to respond to youth crime. And I'm curious, in Connecticut, so often we saw that there is such a high focus on the impact on the victim. In this most recent sort of public outcry, it was actually on the car being the victim. And car thefts being such a big issue here in Connecticut in some people's minds. And so I'm curious how your team went about presenting what's good for the kid is good for society, to sort of shift that discussion.
If I can say some words about that, we all in the judicial sector, we work on with the solidarity to the victims. That's why we work there, to in a way be in the respect for the victims. But that doesn't mean that we can punish the criminals, but we don't need to keep them criminal for the rest of their lives. So serving a sentence is also a kind of a responsibility for the government, because we incarcerate people, we take care of them, we take power over their spare time or their full time. But we don't need to stop giving them education in schools. We don't need to stop giving them bad food or cold rooms or short beds. And that's the way we have to think in a modern society. And I can be kind of personal, because I have 3 boys in my marriage, and the middle one, he was finally diagnosed with an ADHD diagnosis. And for us as a family, with my wife also as a lawyer and me, we were kind of resource family for him. And he's now around 30 years old. But what a struggle it has been. And what about those families who don't have those resources? What about those families who can't read the papers, can't read the laws, can't complain about some kind of unfairness going on? And that is the kind of personal humble I have taken into my job, and been kind of respectful for the extremely complex and difficult work that we have to do talking in a discussion like this. And we should not allow any prison systems to be run by guards, because that's not, we need guards, but we don't only need guards. We also need psychologists, we also need caretakers, we also need motivators, and all those other people who have their right to be in a system like a correctional service should be in all countries.
And with that, we will close out the panel. Thank you, everyone. I'll turn it back over to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you, Hope and Danielle and Brittany, Rep Porter, Heather. We just thank you so much for participating. Per Våge, Per Omdal, really grateful for your time with us today. We've learned so much in these webinars, and your ability to translate your experiences in meaningful ways to us is not lost at all. And, hopefully we'll, you mentioned amend. We've had conversations about the society that surrounds the prisons. We've had conversations now about the political system and the will, and we hope to continue these conversations because it seems like there's an interest here. But we want to thank you. I'm often criticized maybe for optimism, but I'm hopeful that we can get to where you are. And as Attorney Metcalf said, look at it as a floor, not a ceiling. That comment that you made, that exclusion brutalizes, resonates here in Connecticut. I just dropped my 12 and 14-year-old off to school this morning for their last time going to a particular school that goes up to 8th grade. The thought that we treat those youth, her classmates, my son's classmates, as criminals at that age is just perplexing to me. And I'm hopeful that our society can come to see things that way as well. So thank you so much for everything that you've done. Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your time with us, and you can find out more information either at the IMRP website, imrp.dpp.uconn.edu, or the Tau Youth Justice Institute website that I don't have handy on me, but I'm sure you can Google it and find it. And we will send emails to all the participants with follow-ups with slides. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. And good evening to you in Norway, and hope this started your morning well here in Connecticut. Take care.